Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the fourth part of GSA 50, Searching Secure Content. In this session, we'll learn how the GSA handles security. We'll talk about the two aspects of user security, authentication and authorization. And we'll learn how to configure the GSA to crawl and serve secure content. There are many systems that provide secure access to their content. Before you can access that content, two things have to happen. First, you have to prove to the system who you are. We call this process authentication. Typically, this involves presenting a username and password that only you know, or a certificate or token that only you have. We call this your credentials. Once the system knows that you're who you claim to be, it needs to determine whether you're allowed to see the document you've asked for. This process is called authorization. Let's take a look at this process at work. I'm going to switch to a browser and go to a website that uses basic authentication. Let's go ahead and take a look at that process now. We'll take a look at a website that uses basic authentication. So let me switch to a browser. And in my browser, the first thing I'm going to do is put in the URL to the page that requires basic authentication. And you'll notice immediately I get a prompt for authentication. Now normally the user would actually complete that prompt here, but I'm going to go ahead and cancel just so that I can see the whole process. Once I've canceled, I can go down to my developer tools in Chrome. And you'll notice that what I get back when I send my response, or rather when I send my request, I'll get back a response that says 401 authorization required. Now, in real life, the user never sees this because the browser will immediately see that message and reload the page and prompt the user for credentials. So I'll go ahead and just reload the page manually, type in my credentials, and then click on Login. And on this second request made by the browser, I can see that the browser includes a specific header called an authorization header. It tells me the format of my authorization, and then it has this token, which is basically a base64 representation of my password. It's not encrypted. That's basic authentication. For every subsequent page request, my browser would send this to the web server, and the web server would be able to take my credentials and see whether or not I'm allowed to view this page or that page. Okay, so with that under our belts, let's go ahead back and take a look at how the GSA works with authentication. So typically, when you interact with a secure system, you're going to provide your credentials at the beginning of that process. And the system's going to remember who you are for some predetermined length of time. We typically call that a session. And check your authorization every time you try to do something within that system. Authentication can be silent or prompted. And in a web environment, once you've authenticated your browser, it's going to have some sort of token that will be sent to the server on all subsequent page requests. This might be a cookie, or it might be an HTTP authenticate request header like we just saw, depending on the type of authentication process being used. On each page request, the server is going to use that token and see whether or not you're allowed to view a piece of content. Now, when the GSA crawls secure content, it's going to follow the same process as your browser does. The content is going to be marked as secure within the index by default. The GSA supports common authentication mechanisms such as web server authentication and HTML forms-based authentication. At serve time, a user has to authenticate through the GSA in order to view search results. The GSA is going to receive the user's credentials, send them to an authentication repository, a login server to authenticate the user, and then it's going to use those credentials to test authorization for each individual search result on the content server. We call this default approach late binding. It uses a program on the GSA called the head requester. Now, as an alternative to this serve time authorization, you may be able to load document permissions into the GSA at indexing time using a feed containing access control lists, or ACLs. This is called early binding and can perform significantly better. In either case, the default behavior of the GSA is to only show a user the results that that user is allowed to see. To crawl secure content, the GSA supports many standard web-based security protocols. It supports two mechanisms built right into web servers: HTTP Basic and Windows Authentication. Windows Authentication includes NTLM and Kerberos. These mechanisms are commonly used on internal networks, and the GSA supports both of them. It also supports the use of HTML forms with cookies. These are commonly used for websites on the internet that require a login. The items in blue are the most commonly used authentication mechanisms, and the ones that we'll specifically look at in this session. To serve secure content, the GSA will first need to authenticate the user through Basic or Windows Authentication, HTML forms with cookies, LDAP, or X509 client certificates. The GSA also supports Security Assertion Markup Language, or SAML. You can write your own SAML authentication interface, or use SAML interfaces included in many single sign-on products. Silent authentication through a single sign-on agent is also supported. This might use HTML forms or Windows Authentication. If the user is already authenticated through SSO, the user's token can be passed automatically to the GSA. The items in blue are the most commonly used authentication mechanisms, and they're the ones we're going to specifically look at in this session. Now, some authentication mechanisms require a username that the GSA can identify and understand. We call this a verified identity, or user ID. You won't need this if you're using late binding, which will just take the user's authentication token and send it as is to the content server. But if you want to use early binding with ACLs, or use connector-based authorization, you'll need this verified identity to check against the ACLs assigned to users, and in many cases, find out which groups the user belongs to, since ACLs are typically assigned to groups rather than individual users. ACLs can be specified per document or by directory using ACL inheritance or the policy ACL API. There are a variety of authentication mechanisms that can return a verified identity and group membership, but this may require additional configuration. To crawl content that uses Basic or NTLM authentication, you'll go to Crawl and Index, then Crawler Access. There, give the GSA a URL pattern and a set of credentials that will allow it to read all documents matching that pattern. It's a good idea to have a user account that can read everything that is created just for the GSA to use. If you don't want to require security at serve time, check the Make Public checkbox that will be on this page. It's not shown here, but you'll see it on your GSA. To serve this content securely, you'll go to Serving, then Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. Then, go to the HTTP tab and provide a sample URL. The sample URL must meet two requirements. First, it must require security to access. And second, it must be available to all users that need to be authenticated. By default, the GSA will use this URL as an authentication test for users at serve time. Let's take a look at setting up Secure Crawl on the GSA. To do this, I'll switch back to my GSA console, and under Crawl and Index, you'll notice that we already have the URLs for our secure content in both our start and following crawl patterns. So I'll jump directly to Crawler Access, and I'll set up my rule. You'll notice the Make Public checkbox, we mentioned that earlier, We are not going to check it in this case because we want our content to be served securely. So now I can go ahead and click on Save Crawler Access Configuration. Now, once the GSA saves that information, the next time it crawls those documents, it'll use these credentials. So now I'll go under Status and Reports, and go to Crawl Diagnostics, and take a look and see what we have. And you'll notice for our restricted directory, we have 2 errors with the message Authentication failed. Now, directly from within Crawl Diagnostics, I can recrawl this pattern. And we can see that one document has already been recrawled. The other one should be recrawled pretty soon. And there we go. Both of them have been recrawled. It'll presumably take a little bit of time to index those. Now, if we weren't sure why documents weren't being crawled successfully, we can jump to real-time diagnostics. Real-time diagnostics is a great tool to let you see what happens when the GSA requests a document. So let me grab a URL and drop it in here. We'll be able to see the entire process. Once I click on Fetch, we can see the initial GET request that the GSA makes. And you'll notice that there's no authentication or authorization information in that GET request. So the web server responds with a 401, authorization required. The GSA receives that, and then in its subsequent request, it's going to send the authorization information. And finally, we can see that the web server responds with a 200 status code, meaning everything is okay. To serve this content securely, you'll go to Serving, then Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. Then go to the HTTP tab and provide a sample URL. The sample URL must meet 2 requirements. First, it must require security to access, and second, it has to be available to all users who need to be authenticated. By default, the GSA will use this as an authentication test for users at serve time. Let's take a look at what that would be on the GSA. So I'll switch back to my GSA admin console, go back to Serving, and go to Universal Login Auth Mechanisms. You'll see that we've got tabs for different authentication mechanisms at the top. We're going to use the same thing that we used for the crawl, which is HTTP. So I'll click on the HTTP tab. Now, I can fill these fields in manually, but we do have a little convenience here, a little button that will import whatever mechanisms we entered under crawler access. So I'll click on that, save myself a few milliseconds, and you'll notice that brings in the sample URL, gives it a mechanism name, which is really not that important. There's a checkbox here. If we were using NTLM, we would have to choose NTLM, but we're not. We're using basic authentication. So all I have to do is click on Save. Now that I have my Secure Serve set up, I can go ahead and test it out. So I'll go to my front end, and the default front end has the option to do public and secure search. So I'll go ahead and check that option right now. And I'll do a search for something that I think might be in one of the secure documents. I'll search for the word salmon, click on the search button, and the first thing that's going to happen, I'm going to get prompted for credentials. Before I can see any search results, I'm going to have to enter my credentials. Once I've entered my credentials correctly and click on Login, the secure search will run then, and I can see my one search result. Now you'll notice if I actually click on the search result document, it takes me to that document. In this case, it takes me to the document because I've already opened my browser and tried to go to that document earlier. If I hadn't, I might have to authenticate again against that particular web server. Web server authentication is specific to individual web servers. So having authenticated against the GSA doesn't mean I've authenticated against the web server athens.learngsa.com. Everything worked for me just fine, and that was great. But very often, things are not going to work properly for you, so you're going to need to be familiar with how to identify and fix problems. When configuring Secure Crawl, you can use real-time diagnostics, and we already saw that. But when you're configuring Secure Serve, you'll have other things to look at. The GSA logs security information in something called Security Manager, and that's always available. But better still, we have a feature called Serving Logs, and that captures everything about the serving process, including authentication steps taken, the username and groups found, and authorization results found for each document. Serving logs do cause considerable overhead, so you'll want to turn them off when you solve your problem. Also, you may be able to identify problems between the browser and the server by viewing HTTP request and response headers. Most browsers have some built-in or add-on feature to let you view these. Chrome, for example, has its built-in developer tools, as we saw earlier. Let's take a look at some of these now. So I'll switch back to my admin console. And of course, our query worked successfully. But let's go ahead and take a look at where we would go if it didn't work successfully. So I'll go to Status and Reports. And I'll go down to Serving Logs. And I'll look for anything that ran for me in the last half hour or so. And here's the last query that I ran. So I'll go ahead and take that and look at that. And inside the Serving Logs display, it shows the entire process. So the query is received. The GSA sees that it's a secure query based on a URL parameter. It then creates a session. It redirects me to the login mechanism. The login mechanism sees that I don't have any pre-existing credentials. So then it sends me to the login form. Once I fill in the login form successfully, it takes my credentials and tests me against the sample URL. And that worked. Authentication successful. So then, it runs the query internally, and it finds out how many documents actually match the query. If they have ACLs, that shows up here. There are no documents with ACLs, so it does a regular search for other documents, finds one document, and then for each one of those documents, it's going to need to authorize me. So it sends my credentials to this specific document using the head requester, and the Athens web server says, yes, that person's allowed to see it. So then it's presented to the user. If it's filtered out, I would see that down here. So again, serving logs, very useful tool. They show me everything about the serving process. They'll show me where the problem is, if there's a problem. For example, I might have done a search and not gotten any results because I searched for the wrong term. This would show me that security was working, but that there weren't any results that actually matched my search. So serving logs is a very useful tool. We also have, under Serving, under Universal Login, we have Security Manager Logs, which can give us a little bit more depth about the actual security process in some cases. Under Access Control, we have a button that will let us clear the authorization cache. If you're in a testing environment, you might find it useful to clear the authorization cache in between tests, as the GSA will remember previous authorization requests over a short period of time. This concludes our fourth and final presentation, Searching Secure Content. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 50 presentations.